So let's talk intimidation, problem units and fear factor in Warhammer 40k. What are some of the squads and models that people most dread seeing on the other side of the tabletop? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some scary Warhammer 40k threats with a rough top 10 list of units that people don't particularly want to be matched up against. I thought that this one could maybe be a bit of a different take on doing things like a strongest unit for each faction in the game or similar to that, rather than focus on outright datasheet efficiency and unit strength, which generally tends to be at least fairly well known. I thought it could be interesting to ask a different question of people, with which models they find the most intimidating on the other side of the board, and ask about what the average Warhammer 40k player might struggle to deal with their army. For that reason, I'd certainly not confuse this with being any sort of best units in the game type list, though obviously some of the units on this list are very strong, some of the most competitive things around. But when asking a question about most feared things, you're generally unlikely to, say, fear really good objective control or support units. Big dangerous centerpiece models or stat check type armies are maybe going to be more represented, and basically almost everything on this list that was voted seems to fit the bill of the combination of I can't kill this easily, and these units will cause my army some big problems, damage that's likely to be dealt to your most important units, and there's not too much that you can do about it until you manage to end the threat with expending excessive amount of resources. I say that due to that combo, it isn't even necessarily the case that all of these are going to be particularly competitive or strong in game, at least not from the perspective of the player actually using the units, but it can still be intimidating to face down for other players. This video was primarily done from a viewer channel poll from 500 plus responses, and therefore the aim here is to understand what the average Warhammer 40k player would see as a big problem, rather than just talking about the top end of the game and high level competitive stuff, which might not be relevant to everyone. As a bit of a side effect from that though, it does mean that more commonly played armies will get more representation here. If a player plays against one scary unit all the time, it's going to be more prominent in their minds than other stuff. With any sort of survey like this though, got to give a shout out to the fun responses. When asked about what you fear the most in Warhammer 40k, the true terrors were listed as Games Workshop's prices, any opponent generally because I'm not very good, literally every army because I play Admech, an unpainted grey horde, Slime Arbo himself, or Games Workshop's balance passes. I wonder if that one was written by a Chaos Space Marine or World Eaters player. Good to know that plenty of people recognise the true threats out there. Besides that, for honourable mentions before we get into the top 10 proper were 4 scary monsters. From Codex Chaos Demons we had Be'lakor and Shalaxi Hellbane attract quite a lot of attention. Be'lakor's the spooky heart of many Chaos Demon armies. Mainly the thing that really worries people about him is that he has a deny shooting rule out to 18 inches. So it means that if you're playing an army where you're mainly a gun line and you don't really have that many close range or close combat threats, he could be a really big issue. It means that you could have a really big chunk of demon army deployed completely in the open and just not be able to be shot at all by your troops turn 1 due to the influence of the Dark Master. I'd say that's probably the biggest intimidating thing about him. His melee profile's no slouch though, he has some shooting, and perhaps most importantly for Chaos Demons, he's got some personal shadow of chaos that he carries around. That's another very intimidating thing for him to be able to fly out to the mid-board, plonk down a unit that's just 6 inches away from the enemy, and allow an easy charge from reserve from something really nasty. Otherwise for the demons, Shalaxi Hellbane is quite rightly feared, really very pricey at 450 points, kind of hilarious that she's more expensive than all the demon Primarchs there. She is absolutely savage in melee though, really fast, getting towards melee incredibly quickly, and then just spectacular melee damage output, particularly against monsters and vehicles, well capable of downing things like an entire Imperial Knight in one turn with some good rolling. I would argue that she's costed for those abilities, but obviously immense fear factor if she's on the table, and perhaps particularly so if tag teaming with Be'lakor and being unable to be shot turn 1. Otherwise, in the honourable mentions big scary monsters category, we've also got Angron himself. World Eaters might not be particularly strong right now, but he's still a meteoric wrecking ball of Khorne. He can easily do first turn charges and threaten to just solo significant units. His big tough profile means that you're likely going to spend a turn of firing everything at him that you can, and then if he does get taken down early in the game, which is usually kind of necessary, he's got a good chance of respawning on a 666 and coming back with another go in an enormous swing of the game, all very spooky. Then finally, those rules have changed in the Codex Mozrog Scrag Badge from Index Orcs. For their around 200 points, the beast bosses on Squigosaurs are just fantastically tanky. Toughness 10 with a 4+ invulnerable save and a 4+ feel no pain and easy access to -1 to wounds. Between that collection of rules you can make really quite a big amount of damage just go away. From a close combat damage perspective, he is maybe a little bit hit or miss, should hold his own against any more lightly armoured things, but against big things with 2+ saves he can sometimes bounce. There'll be huge differences as to whether or not he gets a devastating wound or two through, or the enemy manages to pass or fail their armour saves, as his AP is kind of low. Still hardly a unit that you can relax around though. With a good roll he could certainly threaten to take down something like a Land Raider in a single turn, even if he can't do so reliably. Will be interesting to see what the new points for the squig bosses are in the codex. They have changed a fair bit, becoming leaders now. Getting into the top 10 as voted by you proper though. First up we're sticking with big scary demon things, and we've got Magnus the Red, kind of a linchpin of the Thousand Suns army for 440 points, legitimately terrifying in my opinion and a very competitive model, sort of carrying the Thousand Suns to fairly good tournament win rates right now on his back. He's got two really threatening psychic profiles with +1 to hit and wound, and can get full rerolls on those shots for 1 CP. And then he's no slouch in melee either, with some serious attacks with that Staff of Magnus to back him up. He's a pretty reasonable target for any Kabbalistic rituals, maybe in particular the one just to ignore enemy armor saves to take him to the next level damage-wise. It's pretty hard to kill if he's played right, -1 damage built in, plus the option to cancel failed saves, both from Kabbalistic rituals and a stratagem, and he can move really fast as well. If it makes sense too, you can spend Kabbalistic rituals for movement rather than damage, and have him zoom across the board and still able to do his psychic shooting. Buffing any other psychic shooting that you have is just icing on the cake at that point. Between all that, maybe not too surprising that he's kind of terrifying, unless your force can find a way to lay him low with some serious focused fire. Voted ninth and maybe a bit less of a single unit, but more of a common theme, was to be seriously quite apprehensive about armies with really quite excessive movement tricks, things that allow you to move out of phase, bounce on and off the board, or just get really big movement characteristics to hit the enemy before they can be hit. I feel like this could be more effective against certain armies than others, maybe ones that are perhaps a little bit slower overall, like the options to either hit them indirect or catch up with them effectively, and might run the risk of being picked apart piecemeal. In general, it just worries people to see things on the other side of the table that can either hit you first really hard, or potentially attack you while remaining safe, perhaps doing jump shoot jump shenanigans like Eldari Shadow Spectres or Scourges. Just in general, I'd say that Eldari are a particularly good example of that. Half their index is built around it. Swooping Hawks can jump on and off the board, putting out some good firepower while doing any secondaries they need to. Warp Spiders can flicker jump 24 inches to blast some infantry with their torrent weapons. And both Phantasm and Fire and Fade can be really powerful, even if Phantasm isn't quite what it was. Otherwise, Drukhari could be another good example. They can do long transport charges with Incubi and have Scourges that can move, shoot, move. Or maybe Grey Knights when they're played very intelligently. Things like 3-inch deep strikes and Mists of Deimos to return to reserve can all be really disruptive, particularly when combined with things like super fast moving Dread Knights or the Sigil of Exigence. They do have big downsides to balance that out, of course, but a lot of armies can be quite spooky and hard to catch up with. Next up, for intimidation factor on the board, seeing a Land Raider on the other side of the table can be problematic for some enemies, perhaps particularly Land Raider Redeemers, which tend to be the most commonly fielded Space Marine variants. Their big stat line is kind of tough and hard to deal with if you haven't brought enough anti-tank along. Toughness 12, 16 wounds and a 2+ save, and they'll very easily be able to get cover, and then usually try and combine that with Armour of Contempt as well for 1 CP. Worsening AP can be a huge deal if you've already got a 2+ save and cover. At that point, even dedicated anti-tank might really struggle against it. Obviously their main purpose is delivering some scary melee units to the midfield, an average charge threat range around about 20 inches from where the Land Raider started, and that can be nasty for a big aggressor Flamestorm combo, Sword Brethren on foot, or maybe on foot Death Company. But then far more so than the Lascannon Land Raider, it certainly can make itself a problem in the enemy turn. The Flamestorm cannons can toast entire squads in your turn, and then go on to threaten some pretty enormous overwatch in the enemy turn on midfield objectives, just meaning that if you put a squad of either elite or lighter infantry on the midfield point, they might just all get burnt to a crisp. They can be even nastier in Firestorm with advance and shoot after that and strength buffs, or if Vulcan Hestan's about. Rerolling wound rolls with flamers and multi-melters does well. Sticking with Space Marines again, and this would be the entry on the list that surprised me the most, there were perhaps a surprising amount of comments saying that they really quite fear Hellblasters, everyone's favourite Primaris with plasma guns that have the ability to shoot on death. I must admit I found this the biggest curveball on the votes out of anything. Core Codex Space Marines aren't really considered super competitive right now, and Hellblasters are rarely played competitively even within those armies. Occasionally they get used, and I'd certainly say they're very usable casually, but they don't really tend to make their way into top tournament lists or anything like that. However, even with those caveats, I do kind of get what people are going for here. They are just generally a fairly destructive unit that is likely to deal some somewhat heavy damage to whatever they can catch. Just mass strength 8 plasma gunfire, lightly paired with Oath of Moment, is likely to take chunks out of one of the enemy's scariest units. Perhaps particularly so if you're going for some sort of big damage combo with them, maybe a Lieutenant with Fire Discipline or Grandmaster Azrael for some damage and defense maybe. They also fire on death on a 3+, which does give you quite a powerful consolation prize for getting them killed. Can just be kind of disruptive to an enemy army if they're trying to destroy these guys, and then you don't know what they're going to light up and ruin your battle plans in return. In general, despite not being a tournament staple unit or anything, they're really quite a commonly played slightly newbie unit maybe, and that's certainly not a bad thing. They've got exciting plasma guns, are very easy to use with general purpose damage, and the fires on death means that even if you get them killed, you're going to get some value out of them. Also, being an easy way to get points into a Space Marine army isn't the worst thing either. I feel like seeing as Space Marines are one of the most common factions, a lot of people will have run into these, might have had bad experiences losing big units to them, and maybe that's why they're featuring here. As said already though, I'd certainly not rate them as overpowered or anything like that, so I'd try not to take them featuring on this list out of context. Moving on, we've got the artillery, and voted 6th was Guard Indirect Fire, specifically Basilisks, Medusas, and Manticores for big hitting damage wherever you want it on the map. Indirect Fire, I think, is generally a little bit intimidating in Warhammer 40k, despite Games Workshop having repeatedly points nerfed the units that are good with it in 10th edition. The game's best artillery still remains to be very relevant. I kind of wonder if it's partly Guard just being able to do indirect fire really quite well, and a lot of other armies just aren't really using it as much or building it in anticipation of playing against it, so when you run into a list with some serious indirect, you might have several units that are pretty optimal targets. Indirect fire is just pretty awesome for all sorts of reasons. You can pick off some easy targets in some small crucial objective scoring units, which can be really big for directly denying victory points, or perhaps annoying the enemy's damage dealers. If you have to have something really big and scary doing grunt work, then that could be a big win for the person with the indirect. You can use it to put the finishing blow on units that your shooting phase has just about left alive, but you need to plink off that last wound or two. A small bit of damage investment can go a long way there. Or otherwise you can just use it literally for damage and hit the single most important thing on the map to help you win the damage game. Potentially just take down a model or two off the enemy's super unit so they don't do absolutely critical damage in their turn. Or maybe go for some targets of opportunity. Perhaps you've got some enemy units hiding out of line of sight that are very dangerous but not really all that hard to kill, and a little bit of indirect goes a long way. For the guard specifically, I really like the Basilisk. Damage 2 indirect fire that also slows down movement. -2 to movement, advance, and charge could keep certain units like slower Terminators out of the game. Otherwise, for a little bit more firepower that threatens heavies, the Manticore and the Medusa Cannon are both still very usable despite points increases at strength 10 and damage 3. Really nice to throw a bit of damage towards some heavy infantry. The Guard have got loads of options to support them as well. Sentinels are particularly nice, Lord Solar can order the artillery, and Fields of Fire could be nice, maybe handed out by Creed for free, to keep the AP nice and high. Certainly some sort of big artillery parking lot type list can be really intimidating to fight against, though even just a few units in a more balanced list can definitely cause problems. Next up and voted in 5th, interestingly, was Necron Firepower units, a ton of mentions for things like Doomstalkers, Locust Destroyers and Heavy Destroyers, and the Doomsday Arc. Maybe the Doomstalkers getting the most attention, perhaps particularly from Canoptech Court. Seems that in general people aren't enjoying being shot by the Necrons, Gauss and Doomsday weapons. Though again, I just found it kind of interesting the choices here. People seem to be a lot more focused on these guys than, say, the super tanky Wraiths. They did get a few mentions, but not as much as the scary Necron Firepower, despite I'd probably argue that the Wraiths with their massive durability gumming up the midboard could cause more problems overall. Generally all of these can be really quite scary long-range firepower units though. Out of any of them I'd probably rate the Doomstalkers in Canoptech Court as perhaps one of the most standout. With their 4 hit rerolls, good AP and okay damage, they're at least okay against armour, though really they particularly stand out against heavy infantry. Lots of damage 3 is pretty intimidating there. Canoptech Court can keep them really safe as well. They can bounce a bunch of fire off their 4+ invulnerable saves, and if it looks like one of them is taking too much heat and might get brought down, you could then use the hide a unit stratagem to keep it alive and shooting till next turn. The other units also got some mentions like Heavy Destroyers, Doomsday Arcs, Locusts, and Monoliths. The heavy destroyers, perhaps the most out of them. I guess it's just the intimidation factor of enormous, great big Gauss weapons with flat damage 6. That's a fantastically scary profile to have on a somewhat cheap model, even if they're not that durable for the cost. It means that the enemy army just can't really relax while they're around, and they're a threat that needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. They can be quite hard to handle in Hypercrypt as well, when they can threaten to warp around the board to gain line of sight on the single thing that's most important to them. As I've said though, I wouldn't necessarily consider these overpowered or anything like that. I'd say most of them are really quite fairly costed, maybe attracting more attention as Necrons, given that they might well be sat at the back, chipping away at your forces while you're struggling to deal with all the other things like Wraiths and Catan. Voted in fourth, we have the molten body that is the Avatar of Khaine. I would have guessed that the income would have been more mentioned before the last balanced data slate, I suspect. In any case, the incarnation of the Eldari god of war is a force to be reckoned with. He is really big and tough and hard to kill. Toughness 12, a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable, 14 wounds and halving damage inflicted on him. He is going to bounce a lot of damage, could have a good cover save. And if you've got a regular Farseer in the list as well, then he could be -1 to wound as well, which is going to make anything that's less than strength 12 incredibly ineffective against him. Even for the wounds that you do have, you could potentially feed him fate dice of maybe 4 or 5s to pass those invulnerables. For his actual threat, I wouldn't underestimate the shooting. There's only really one massive melter shot at strength 16, AP 4 and damage d6+2, but he does get sustained d3 hits on a 6. And that means that if you do look out and roll a 6, then he could actually one-round a big tank, and he could make that happen with a fate dice if you have one to spare with that Farseer nearby. And it either could be done when he's actually shooting himself, or in Overwatch in reaction to an enemy moving up. That's usually be 3 hits at that profile on average, and that could certainly be enough to just outright destroy an enemy vehicle if you roll okay, particularly with Battle Host rerolls. Otherwise, he is just a general purpose threat in melee. Other 6 attacks at strength 14 at damage d6+2, again battle host rerolls, meaning that most of those will hit and wound, or an anti-horde type profile at strength 7 and damage 2 that makes short work of Space Marines. Certainly not hard to understand the fear factor here, a unit that several armies are just going to struggle to bring down, particularly if he's got the -1 to wound in place, and a reasonable enough chance to destroy what he's touching, potentially with Overwatch threats to kill you in your own turn. In spite of all that, though, I would still say that his 335 points is genuinely pretty fairly costed for what he does. He doesn't actually make it into the majority of Eldari competitive lists right now, tending to go a lot more for sneaky units jumping around in cover. Though he does see occasional play, he is on the stronger side of the Eldari faction, I'd argue. Moving on, and voted in third was a couple of things I thought that made most sense to group together. Basically any sort of massive armoured army. An entire force where you've got a big abundance of things with high toughness and high saves. Maybe a few good examples being knights of any description, Ironstorm Space Marines with loads of dreadnoughts and gladiator tanks, or another one that was brought up quite a bit was heavily armoured guard, things like Rogue Dawns, Mass Leman Russes, or even Baneblade variants. Overall, between all those, this sort of thing is just a very common "this scares me" type of response. I think it's a bit more common in 10th edition that that's the case as well. Given the stretching of the toughness chart, it means that you're a lot more often needing to have actual genuine anti-tank weapons to take down tanks and big vehicles. There are plenty of armies out there that, if confronted by an absolutely maximal amount of armour in the enemy list, are just not going to be able to efficiently take down the targets well enough. And just going to be fighting a game on an uphill struggle, having to do clever hiding objective type things, and trying to win the game on points while they're probably losing the damage game overall. Generally, if you do go super heavy on really big scary models though, they're also going to have fairly massive damage output too. Probably something that just tends to directly win and dominate games, maybe in a more casual setting a little bit more commonly than top tier competitive. I feel like in slightly more casual games you're going to have far fewer people doing clever objective move blocking type things and playing with really dense terrain that allow those shenanigans to be a bit more possible. And just armies that aren't particularly optimised maybe tend to be lacking in anti-tank more so than anti-infantry. For the specific examples, knights of both types are perhaps the most guaranteed of the skew lists. They're basically going to be an entire army of walkers and vehicles with good damage output, often perhaps a good metric to check whether your army can handle an army like that. If not, you might need to think about a bit more anti-armour. Both of those are sort of mid for 40k right now, strong but not overpowered. Ironstorm Spearhead for Space Marines can be really quite scary, particularly with lots of dreadnoughts and good use of Armour of Contempt and their damage dealer stratagems. And while guard armor is not a particularly big thing on the competitive scene, a whole load of wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save can certainly be daunting looking if you're going into it. Lots of people might just have certain units in their army that can actually affect that kind of profile meaningfully, and a lot of the rest is going to have to go after the rest of the army and just try not to think about the tanks pointing big guns at them. It's perhaps particularly intimidating when you see them in really big blocks like the Baneblade or the Rogue or Dawn perhaps. It can feel like a bad idea to shoot those sort of things in the first place if you think you're just going to take a bunch of wounds off them and not quite half kill them or something like that, and then the enemy gets to hit you back on absolute full damage output next turn, which could be a big swing. Next up, and keeping with our theme of stat check type armies, we've got the Adeptus Custodes. Currently, until their digital points and codex goes on sale, they're still the index version at the moment. Though to be honest, even in the times when Custodes are weak, they often tend to be at least fairly intimidating to go against. You're going to be seeing a whole load of high toughness, high invulnerable save, and high save bodies on the board. Again, like the vehicles and things, you just might not have enough weapons at that kind of profile to be able to meaningfully damage all of them, and they might give you some tricky decisions as to what you do in terms of trying to engage and manage that battle line, as you can't afford not to fight over the midfield objectives. You probably can't kill them all too quickly, but you also can't afford to just get massive charged by a whole load of Guardian Spears that might make short work of some of your elites. Until the Codex actually goes live, they remain one of the absolute strongest armies in the game. Win rates are around about 55%, though obviously the Codex might have different storage now. Perhaps for particularly oppressive things that made the Custodes feel hard to play are fights first that they could have in multiple places in the army, one with Trajan Valoris and one with a stratagem. The mortal wound and devastating wound protection means that one of the things that should be ridiculously effective against them isn't really that great, though arguably, as we saw when they didn't have it, they were very underpowered. And in particular, out of their infantry units, Wardens tanking things on a 4+ feel no pain can be a very solid unit to remove, even when they're focused fire by a whole ton of units. As we've been talking about over the last few days though, the updated codex doesn't seem to be great for them. Their fights first is basically gone, the mortal wound and devastating wound protection took a big hit, as did quite a lot of other stratagems and plenty of datasheet rules as well. I'm sure at least some armies might be breathing a sigh of relief that they don't have to deal with current index Custodes anymore. Even if points depending, it's looking like it's going to be a fairly rough time to be a Golden Guardian of the Emperor. Finally, and surprising nobody at the top of the Scary 40k units list right now, are the Necron Catan. They really hit the major criteria for units that people fear quite well, both being really tanky and are going to cause problems, as well as just being scary centerpiece models that put fear into you because they do a lot in game. They're also very undercosted at the moment compared with their abilities. Some armies out there in Warhammer 40k just don't really have an answer to them if they're played well in a competitive list. It is perfectly possible for some armies to throw an entire shooting phase at a Catan for surprisingly little damage. Their toughness 11, have a 4+ invulnerable save, half damage, have a feel no pain of 5+, and then if you don't kill them outright, they'll reanimate, gradually regrowing those spectacularly hard wounds to remove. They're perhaps more oppressive if you have more of them, or if they're being played in games that are smaller than 2,000 points, where your opponent might have even less tools to deal with them. While you can potentially field a lot of them if you utilise multiple Transcendent Catans, the most common ones that make appearance in competitive lists are the Nightbringer and the Void Dragon, who don't just have the spectacular tankiness, but are also just enormous threats in their own right, and have a good chance of one-rounding most enemy heavy hitters. They're easy enough to include in literally any detachment, I think. Just move them towards the midfield objectives and watch them soak up a whole bunch of firepower while the rest of your army does its thing. But they're kind of spectacularly amazing in Hypercrypt, warping them around the table, potentially dropping one within 3 inches of an enemy unit to get an absolutely enormous threat into the enemy backfield. I feel like it's not awful they do have some fairly godly profiles, as they are shards of living Necron gods, but at the moment they're commonly considered not to be paying appropriate points for them. I'd say they're the single biggest reason why Necrons are at the absolute top of the 40k meta right now, winning more tournaments and being more of a threat than any other army in the game. I feel like if you're just Catan, then Necrons are going to be far less of a problem faction, while still having some strong detachments, good units and nice tricks. I'd say they're pretty much certain to get some sort of nerf in the next balanced data slate, we just don't know what it'll be yet. In any case, let me know what you think down in the comments below. Which units do you find the most intimidating to see on the other side of the board? Look forward to hearing what it puts the fear into your own particular army or faction, and what you might struggle to handle more than most. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep them coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.